The light in the grand chamber of the conquered was ancient. A soft, pearlescent glow filtered through crystalline panes that had witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 stellar empires. It illuminated the floating obsidian thrones of the delegates, each a monolith of polished darkness, suspended in the vast, silent cavern by gravitic fields older than most of the species they held. At the chamber's heart, a swirling nebula of holographic data cast ethereal blues and purples across the stern, alien faces of the assembled Galactic Council. A profound, almost sacred silence reigned, the kind of quiet that precedes either a verdict or a death sentence. High Arbiter Vorlag of the Cathar Imperium felt the weight of that silence in his three hearts, each one beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his armored carapace. His multifaceted eyes, usually sharp and discerning, now felt clouded, as if the very air, recycled for millennia, had grown thick with an unspoken poison. The betrayal was done. The treaty had been ratified in secret, the data pact sealed, and a world had been sacrificed. Elysium VII, a human colony world, a vibrant nexus of a species barely old enough to map its own galactic arm, had been ceded to the voracious hegemony. A morsel tossed to a predator to keep it from the Council's own bloated, complacent core worlds. It had been argued, with the chillingly precise logic of the silicon-based Glypton delegates, as a necessary calculus of survival. A single, young world in exchange for the security of hundreds of elder systems. A trivial price. But Vorlag, whose people had etched their codes of honor into the very rock of their homeworld, felt a profound sickness coiling in his gut. It was not the logic he questioned, but the void it left behind. He had studied the humans, a species of baffling contradictions. They were fragile, short-lived creatures of soft flesh and brittle bone, yet they had clawed their way to the stars with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. They were emotionally volatile, prone to internal conflict and self-destruction, yet they possessed a capacity for unity in crisis that was both terrifying and admirable. Their art was filled with sorrow, their histories drenched in blood, but their philosophy always inevitably reached for something luminous, something they called hope. The Council had dismissed them as newcomers, as children playing with forces they did not understand. They had seen their rapid expansion not as a sign of strength, but of recklessness, and so they had been deemed expendable. The resonance of the decision is stable. A voice, crystalline and devoid of emotion, echoed through the chamber. It was Delegate Xylos of the Glypton technocracy, its crystalline form shimmering within its throne. The hegemony has acknowledged the transfer of territorial sovereignty. Their fleets are moving to occupy the Elysium system. The probability of a retaliatory strike from the humans is minimal. Their fleet dispositions are scattered, their command structure fractured by our recent trade sanctions. They are not in a position to challenge both the hegemony and the authority of this council. Xylos' statement was a placid sea of data, yet beneath it, Vorlag felt a dangerous current. The Glyptons saw the universe as a grand equation, and they had balanced it. But there were variables they had not accounted for, variables that could not be quantified. A low, resonant hum vibrated from the throne of the Lumina, an entity of pure, sentient energy contained within a shimmering containment field. The calculus of survival does not absolve the calculus of honor, Delegate Xylos. We have traded the trust of a nascent species for a temporary peace with an insatiable one. The echoes of this choice will resonate longer than the stability you measure. The Lumina's voice was like the chiming of distant stars, beautiful and melancholic. It spoke of principles, of the spirit of the conquered, a spirit Vorlag feared had long since withered, leaving only the hollow shell of political pragmatism. Honor is a luxury the living can afford, sneered a harsh, grating voice from the shadows. It was Warlord Grask of the Signian Dominion, a hulking, insected being whose species measured worth in conquered territory. The humans were a weed growing too fast in a garden that was not theirs. We have merely pruned them. The hegemony will find them a tougher meal than they expect, and in the ensuing struggle both will be weakened. The Council will remain strong. Grask's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. He, and many like him, had long viewed humanity's rise with suspicion and jealousy. To them, this was not a betrayal, but a long-overdue correction of the galactic order. Vorlag's gaze drifted to the central nebula of data. He focused on the Elysium system. According to their intelligence, the human fleet in the sector was small, a mere patrol force. The hegemony's armada, a vast, consuming tide of biomechanical horrors, would be upon them in hours. The Council had jammed all interstellar communications to the colony, cutting them off, ensuring they would be deaf and blind until the very end. It was a cold, efficient, and deeply dishonorable act. He had argued against it, his voice a lone storm against a tide of fear and expediency. He had warned them that to corner a creature like humanity was to invite a response they could not predict. His warnings had been dismissed as the sentimentality of an aging warrior. "High Arbiter," Xylos's voice cut through his thoughts. "You have been silent. Your assent was crucial in the final vote. Do you now harbor regrets?" Vorlag shifted his immense frame in his throne. The gravitic field groaned, a low thrum of protest. He turned his multifaceted eyes toward the Glypton. "I harbor a concern, delegate. My assent was given because the alternative was a fractured council and an immediate galaxy-wide war. I chose the path that preserved this body, but we have operated on an assumption I fear is flawed, that the humans will react as we would, that they will rage or plead or bargain, that they will lash out with predictable fury. I have reviewed their history. When faced with an overwhelming foe, they do not always break. They do not always scatter. Sometimes they coalesce. They become something other than a collection of individuals. They become a single, unified weapon, driven by a logic that is not of resource or territory, but of sheer, unyielding defiance. Poetry, High Arbiter, Grass grasped. Their defiance will be a brief, bright flash and then darkness. They are mortal. They fear death as all creatures do. They do, Vorlag agreed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. But their history suggests they fear the death of their ideals even more. They build monuments to their fallen. They create legends out of last stands. We have given them a cause, Warlord Grask. We have given them a betrayal so profound it may burn away their internal divisions. We may have inadvertently created the very unified enemy we have always feared. A tense silence fell once more. The delegates considered his words. The lumina's light pulsed in slow, mournful agreement. Even Xylos seemed to recalculate, its crystalline mind processing this new, unquantifiable variable. The air grew heavy with a shared, unspoken anxiety. What if the High Arbiter was right? What if their clever, pragmatic solution had been a catastrophic miscalculation? The quiet was suddenly shattered by a soft, insistent chime. An alert. All eyes turned to the central hololith. A communications sigil had appeared, flashing with calm, unwavering persistence. It was not a distress call. It was not a military channel. It was a formal diplomatic request, broadcast on an open, universal frequency. A frequency that was supposed to be impossible for them to use, as the Council's network blockade around Elysium was absolute. Yet there it was, a simple, elegant symbol glowing serenely in the data haze, the symbol of the Terran diplomatic corps. A tremor of genuine fear, cold and sharp, passed through the chamber. It was a fear not of an incoming attack, but of the unknown. How were they broadcasting? Why were they requesting diplomatic contact when they should be screaming for help or cursing their names to the void? Warlord Grask shifted, his carapace plates scraping together. A trick, a desperate plea disguised as formality. Let them beg. It will serve as a lesson to any others who would challenge the Council's wisdom. "No," Vorlag said, his voice cutting through the chamber with absolute authority. "We will answer it. We made this choice. We will not hide from its consequences." He gestured with a massive, clawed hand. "Open the channel." The chamber's ambient light dimmed, focusing all attention on the center. The diplomatic sigil dissolved, and the holographic nebula reshaped itself. They expected a flickering, grainy image of a desperate colonial governor or a furious fleet admiral. They expected a face contorted with anger or despair. They did not expect the figure that materialized before them. It was a human male, standing not on a view screen, but as a perfect, three-dimensional projection of solid light, so real that Vorlag could see the faint, steady pulse of a vein in his temple. The fidelity was impossible. It was a technology no one in the Council possessed, a real-time projection across light-years of blockaded space. The man was of middling years, his hair touched with gray at the temples, his face etched with lines that spoke of thought rather than hardship. He wore a simple, dark blue uniform, devoid of rank or adornment. He was utterly, unnervingly calm. His eyes, a shade of deep, contemplative brown, swept across the assembled delegates, acknowledging each of them with a slow, deliberate gaze that held no fear, no hatred, only a profound, bottomless disappointment. He stood in the heart of their most sacred chamber, an uninvited ghost of their own making, and the power dynamic in the room shifted so fundamentally it was as if the very laws of gravity had been suspended. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to confront the image of the species they had just condemned. When he finally broke the quiet, his voice was not loud, but it filled the immense space completely. It was measured, resonant, and carried the weight of a sorrow that was older and deeper than mere anger. "I am emissary Valerius of the Terran Confederacy," he said, his gaze finally settling on Vorlag, as if recognizing the true center of authority in the room. "I speak to you today not as a petitioner, nor as an enemy, but as a witness. A witness to an act that will be recorded in our histories, not as a casualty of war, but as a failure of principle. You, the Galactic Council, who styled yourselves as the guardians of cosmic law and the shepherds of civilization, have made a choice. In your fear, you have sacrificed honor for expediency. You have fed one of our children to the wolves to keep them from your own door. The directness of the accusation was a physical blow. There was no diplomatic preamble, no cautious wording, just the cold, unvarnished truth laid bare in the heart of their power. Warlord Grask let out a chitinous hiss. Insolence. You are a fleeting species, a speck of dust in the eye of galactic history. We have ensured the survival of trillions. Your small loss is irrelevant. Valerius's gaze shifted to Grask. The calmness in his eyes did not waver, but it intensified, becoming something sharp, something that could cut. The value of a civilization is not measured in its age or its numbers, Warlord. It is measured in the principles it is willing to die for. You have just shown us that your principles are for sale. And you have shown us the price. You speak of survival, but what precisely are you trying to preserve? This chamber, these thrones, the fear that led you to this decision, a body that preserves its own existence at the cost of its soul is already dead. You are merely waiting for the flesh to rot. The chamber fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. Xylos, the Glypton, spoke, its voice a cascade of precise tones. Your philosophical stance is noted, emissary. However, the logic of the situation is undeniable. The hegemony is a threat of an existential nature. Your colony was strategically positioned to serve as a buffer, a calculated sacrifice. That is where you are mistaken, Valerius replied, his voice softening with a chilling pity. There is no such thing as a calculated sacrifice of a sentient life, not to us. You operate from a flawed premise, that we think as you do, that we would weigh a world and its people on a scale and find it wanting. This is the great gap in your understanding of us. It is the variable you failed to include in your equation. As he spoke, he made a subtle gesture with his hand. The holographic data field behind him shifted. The swirling nebula of abstract information vanished, replaced by a live, real-time sensor feed of the Elysium system. The image was stark. The lone human patrol fleet, a handful of silver ships, hung in the void. In the distance, the star charts showed the imminent arrival of the hegemony's overwhelming force, a red tide of doom. You expected a battle, Valerius continued, his voice a calm narration over the scene of impending slaughter. You expected us to fight and die, to bloody the hegemony's nose and buy you more time. You expected a glorious, futile last stand that your historians could perhaps write a footnote about. You expected us to play our assigned part in your grand, cynical drama. On the display, the hegemony fleet translated from hyperspace. It was a terrifying sight. A swarm of jagged, asymmetrical ships, more like metallic organisms than machines, blotted out the stars. Their numbers were obscene, a locust plague ready to devour a world. The council delegates watched, a knot of dread tightening in their collective consciousness. This was the annihilation they had orchestrated, but the human fleet did not engage. They did not power weapons. Instead, they turned, forming a protective cordon not around the planet Elysium VII, but around a point in empty space near its largest moon. And then something began to happen on the planet below. It started as a faint tracery of light on the surface, a filigree of silver energy that spread across the continents like veins of lightning. Cities, towns, vast agricultural arcologies all began to shimmer with this impossible ethereal glow. The light grew in intensity, a soft, enveloping brilliance that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of reality. Your mistake was in thinking that we would fight for the soil, Valerius said, his voice imbued with a quiet, profound solemnity. We do not fight. GHT for dirt and rock, counselors. We fight for people. The only resource that has ever truly mattered to us is life itself. You ceded a world to the hegemony. You gave them a piece of territory, and we have chosen to let them have it. The light on the planet's surface pulsed, a single, silent, planetary heartbeat. And then, in a moment that defied every known law of physics held by the Council, the light vanished, and with it, everything. The cities, the infrastructure, the spaceports, the orbital stations, even the great atmospheric processors. They did not explode. They were not beamed away. They simply ceased to be there. The sensor readings were nonsensical. 1 billion human life signs present one moment were gone the next. The entire population and its works had been excised from reality. The planet Elysium VII was still there, a sphere of rock and water, but it was now barren. An empty, silent monument to the Council's miscalculation. A wave of disbelief and horror washed through the grand chamber. Xylos's crystalline form flickered erratically, a sign of processing overload. Warlord Grask's mandibles hung agape. Even the lumina's glow seemed to dim in shock. Vorlag stared, his 3 hearts pounding. This was not technology as they knew it. It was something else entirely. something that treated spacetime not as a barrier to be crossed, but as a medium to be rewritten. The hegemony fleet, arriving to conquer a thriving world, slowed in confusion. Their forward scouts relayed images of an empty planet, a ghost world stripped bare. Their prize had been rendered worthless. "We call it a noetic fold," Valerius explained calmly, as if discussing a simple matter of engineering. "A practical application of quantum observation. In essence, we are not moving people from one place to another. We are redefining where they are. The lives on Elysium VII are safe. They are already being resettled on a new world, one far from your influence and your betrayals." His gaze swept over them once more, and now the disappointment was mixed with a cold, hard finality. "This brings me to the purpose of this communication. You have issued a verdict upon our worth. Now we issue ours upon you. We are delivering a final warning, but it is not a threat. A threat implies a desire for a different outcome. We have no such desire." He paused, letting the full weight of his statement settle into the stunned silence. "Effective immediately, the Terran Confederacy is withdrawing from the Galactic Concord. All treaties are nullified, all trade will cease. All shared scientific and cultural exchanges are terminated. We are severing all contact. The knowledge we have shared with you, our advancements in medicine, in energy production, in materials science, is now yours to do with as you will, but there will be no more. We are placing you in quarantine." "Quarantine?" Grask snarled, finding his voice at last. "You dare? You are isolating yourselves, fleeing into the dark." "No," Valerius corrected him, his voice unwavering. "We are isolating *U*, a civilization that has become so consumed by fear that it eats its own young is a contagion. Your political decay, your moral cowardice, your stagnant philosophy, these are diseases we no longer wish to be exposed to. You sought to preserve your stability by sacrificing us. You will now have that stability, the perfect, unthreatened, unchanging stability of the tomb." He looked directly at Vorlag, a flicker of something almost like sympathy in his eyes. "You feared a war with the hegemony, and so you tried to direct its hunger toward us, but the hegemony is not hungry for territory, High Arbiter. It is hungry for life, for technology, for a vibrant, thriving civilization to consume. You have offered it a barren rock. Its hunger is not sated. It is merely enraged. The enemy is at your door, just as before, but now you will face it alone." The human fleet on the holoscreen, their impossible work complete, began to vanish, not by jumping to hyperspace or activating a drive field. One by one, the silver ships simply folded out of existence, leaving nothing behind but empty space and the baffled, furious hegemony armada. "This is our final warning," Emissary Valerius concluded, his solid light form beginning to lose its cohesion, its edges blurring into the air. "It is a warning that principles are not abstractions. They are the load-bearing structures of a civilization, and yours have crumbled. We will watch from a distance as you reckon with the consequences of your choices. We hope you learn. We hope you evolve, but we will not help you. You have made your bed of ashes. Now you must lie in it." The projection of Emissary Valerius dissolved completely, leaving behind only the ghost image of the empty planet and the seething hegemony fleet. The diplomatic channel closed. Silence, absolute and suffocating, returned to the grand chamber. It was a different kind of silence now. It was not the quiet of authority, but the hollow echo of a profound and irreversible error. Vorlag looked at the faces of his fellow delegates. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening terror. The humans had not declared war. They had passed judgment, and their verdict was abandonment. They had been left alone in the dark with the monsters they had tried to appease. The immediate aftermath was chaos, a storm of recrimination and panic that raged within the grand chamber for what felt like an eternity. Warlord Grask bellowed, accusing the humans of cowardice, of using some arcane trick to deny him his rightful conquest. Delegate Xylos went silent, its crystalline form pulsing with a frantic, internal light as it tried to model the impossible physics of the noetic fold, its logic gates crashing against the wall of human ingenuity. The other delegates devolved into a cacophony of fear, their carefully constructed political alliances fracturing under the weight of their shared guilt and a new, more potent terror. They had not merely been outmaneuvered. They had been fundamentally misunderstood, their entire worldview exposed as a fragile provincial thing. They had seen themselves as the galaxy's ordained rulers, and a species they considered barely adolescent had just dismissed them as irrelevant, as a failed experiment to be walled off from the rest of the cosmos. Vorlag, alone among them, remained still and silent, his mind a maelstrom of introspection. He replayed Valerius's every word, every subtle inflection, every calm, damning glance. The human had not been gloating. He had been mourning. Mourning the death of an ideal, the ideal that the Galactic Council was a force for good. Vorlag felt a strange kinship with that sorrow. He, too, had believed in the conquered, in the union of disparate species working toward a common, enlightened future. But Valerius was right. It had decayed. It had become a self-serving bureaucracy, a club for ancient powers terrified of losing their grip on history. They had become the very thing they had once sworn to oppose, a stagnant empire clinging to the past, willing to sacrifice the future to preserve the comfort of the present. The hegemony did not wait long. Denied their promised prize, their rage was immediate and absolute. Their vast fleet, already mobilized at the edge of council space, did not retreat or pause to reconsider. It surged forward, a wave of unstoppable fury, crashing against the council's outermost defensive bastions. The war the council had so desperately tried to avoid by an act of supreme dishonor had come anyway, and it was 1,000 times more savage than their worst projections. The hegemony fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. They did not use strategy as the council understood it. There were no feints, no tactical withdrawals, no attempts to secure supply lines. It was a singular, all-consuming advance, a tide of metal and fire that sought only to annihilate everything in its path. Reports flooded the grand chamber, each one a death knell for a star system, a fleet, a world. The border sectors, stripped of their best fleets to reinforce the core in anticipation of the original hegemony threat, fell in days. The Council's vaunted fleets, designed for methodical, honor-bound combat, were overwhelmed by the sheer, brutal arithmetic of the hegemony's assault. Their ships were powerful, their commanders seasoned, but they were prepared for a chess match, and the hegemony was simply overturning the board. The void lanes, the stable hyperspace corridors that formed the arteries of council travel, became death traps, easily blockaded and ambushed by the hegemony's unpredictable swarms. The council was being dismembered, its ancient and glorious body bleeding out into the void. In the midst of this escalating catastrophe, Vorlag finally acted. He rose from his throne, his immense shadow falling over the panicked assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was not a roar of command, but a low, resonant growl of cold, hard truth that cut through the hysteria like a blade of obsidian. "Silence," he commanded. The chamber, for the first time in days, fell quiet. "Look at you, cowering, blaming, squabbling over who is to blame for the storm that is upon us. We are all to blame. Our fear, our arrogance, our spiritual decay, this is the architect of our doom." He turned his gaze to the holographic map, where dozens of red icons representing the hegemony advance were extinguishing the blue lights of council worlds. Warlord Grask was wrong. Emissary Valerius was right. The humans did not flee. They made a choice. They chose to preserve what was most valuable to them, their people and their principles. We chose to preserve only our power, and in doing so, we have lost everything. He paused, his multifaceted eyes scanning the faces of the delegates, seeing not leaders but frightened children. There is only one path forward. It is a path of humility, a path we have not walked in 10,000 years. We must ask for help. The idea was met with a wave of indignant protest. Ask the upstart humans for help, the very species they had betrayed, beg them to save the civilization that had just condemned them. It was unthinkable, a humiliation beyond measure. "Our pride is a luxury we can no longer afford," Vorlag thundered, his voice finally rising to a full-throated roar that shook the crystalline lights. "What is more humiliating? To ask for aid from those we have wronged, or to be scoured from existence by the consequences of our own cowardice? We will not send a demand. We will not offer a bargain. We will send a message of pure, unvarnished contrition. We will admit our failure. We will confess our betrayal. We will lay our civilization's fate at their feet and ask for nothing but their mercy." It was a speech that shattered the last vestiges of their arrogance. There was no other option. Their fleets were burning, their worlds were dying, and their enemy was inexhaustible. The council, in a gesture of desperation that would have been unimaginable just weeks prior, drafted a message. Vorlag himself dictated the words, pouring into them all the shame and regret he felt, all the weight of his ancient honor now tarnished. He confessed their fear, their miscalculation, their moral failure. He did not ask the humans to fight for them. He asked them for forgiveness and guidance, admitting that the council had lost its way. The message was encoded and broadcast on an open channel, a public admission of their guilt for the entire galaxy to witness. For days, there was no reply. The hegemony advance continued, relentless and brutal. A sense of final despair settled over the conquered. The humans were gone. They were watching them die just as Valerius had promised. The council had been judged and found wanting, and their sentence was extinction. They had been left alone. Then, on the 10th day, as the hegemony's primary battle group prepared to assault the capital of the Signian Dominion, Warlord Grask's own throne world, it happened. The space before the hegemony fleet, a calm, stardusted black, tore open. not with the familiar, shimmering rupture of a void lane translation, but with a silent, geometric precision. Reality itself seemed to fold inward, and from these impossible tiers in the universe the human fleet emerged. It was not a small flotilla this time. It was a vast, silent armada of silver ships, their designs sleek and purposeful, radiating an aura of quiet, deadly competence. They appeared in perfect tactical formation, flanking the hegemony fleet in a single, instantaneous maneuver that defied all strategic logic. They had not traveled, they had simply arrived. The Council watched, breathless, via the few remaining sensor relays in the sector. The human fleet did not broadcast any triumphant proclamations or demands for fealty. They simply opened fire. Their weapons were unlike anything the Council had ever witnessed. Lances of pure, coherent spacetime sheared through the hegemony's biomechanical hulls, not melting or exploding them, but unmaking them on a fundamental level. Beams of contained gravitational force crushed swarms of smaller attack drones into singularities. The human ships moved with a fluid, coordinated grace, a silent dance of annihilation, each vessel acting in perfect concert with the whole. There was no chaos, no wasted energy. It was the cold, efficient, and terrifyingly beautiful application of overwhelming force. The hegemony, which had seemed an unstoppable force of nature, was being systematically dismantled. They fought back with their usual feral intensity, but their weapons splashed harmlessly against shimmering, multi-layered shields that seemed to warp reality around the human vessels. In the grand chamber, the delegates could only stare in awe and terror. This was the power they had so casually dismissed. This was the strength of the species they had tried to sacrifice. The humans were not just advanced. They were a quantum leap beyond them, operating on a level of physical and strategic understanding that the Council could not even begin to comprehend. They had been living in a galaxy with gods and had never even realized it. With the immediate threat to the Cygnian throne world neutralized, the human fleet did not vanish. They held their position, a silent, silver wall between the Council and its enemy. A single communication channel opened, directed to the Grand Chamber. It was Emissary Valerius once more, his solid light form appearing in the center of the room. His expression was unchanged, calm, serious, contemplative. "High Arbiter Vorlag," he began, his voice devoid of triumph. "We received your message." Vorlag rose slowly, the weight of his office and his shame heavy on his shoulders. "Emissary, we do not have the words to express our gratitude or our remorse." "Gratitude is not required," Valerius stated flatly. Indeed, remorse is a matter for your own conscience. Let me be clear, we are not here to save the Galactic Council. That institution, in our eyes, is already a relic. We are here because the hegemony's aggression, if left unchecked, will eventually consume all life in this galactic arm, innocent and guilty alike. We do not act to preserve your power. We act to prevent a greater extinction. We will fight alongside your fleets. We will share our tactical data. We will push the hegemony back. But this is not a restoration of the old order. It is the beginning of a new one. When this is over, we will talk about what comes next, and it will be a conversation between equals. A new alliance was forged, not in the gilded halls of diplomacy, but in the crucible of a desperate war. Human ships appeared at every major flashpoint, their noetic fold drives allowing them to bypass blockades and reinforce besieged worlds in an instant. They fought alongside Cathar battlecruisers and Glypton logic frigates, their presence turning the tide in every battle. Humans shared their tactical systems, linking the disparate and often disorganized Council fleets into a single, cohesive fighting force. They did not share the secrets of their core technologies, their drives, or their weapons, but they gave the Council the tools it needed to fight effectively. During this new, joint campaign, a plan was hatched. It was not enough to simply defeat the hegemony fleet by fleet. They had to understand what drove them. A special operations unit, a combined force of human strategists and Glypton analysts, was tasked with capturing a hegemony command node ship intact. It was a near-impossible mission, but after a brutal, close-quarters battle in the debris field of a shattered star system, they succeeded. A massive bioorganic capital ship, crippled but with its central processing core still functional, was secured. It was towed to a secure research outpost deep within Cathar territory. There, under the watchful eyes of Vorlag and Valerius, who now stood side by side as commanders of the Allied forces, the human and Glypton science teams began the delicate process of interfacing with the alien mind of the hegemony. They expected to find a core programming of relentless expansion, a simple, brutal imperative for conquest. What they found was something far more ancient and far more terrifying. The Glypton lead analyst, its crystalline form networked directly with the ship's neural matrix, began to emit a series of discordant chimes, a sign of extreme cognitive dissonance. Incoherence, logical paradox, it toned. Their primary drive is not aggression, it is flight. Their expansion is not a conquest, it is a desperate, frantic search. A search for what? Vorlag demanded, his claws tightening on the railing of the observation deck. A refuge, Valerius murmured, his eyes fixed on the swirling data streams projected in the air. Look at the deep archive memory. It's fragmented, corrupted by millennia of panicked replication, but it's there. The human scientists isolated a data packet, a fossilized remnant buried deep within the hegemony's collective consciousness. They filtered it, decoded it, and played it back. It was not a visual or auditory file. It was a raw sensory transmission, a psychic echo. As it filled the room, a profound and unnatural chill descended. It was a feeling of immense, crushing loneliness, of a vast, silent emptiness. It was the feeling of being the last light flickering in an infinite, encroaching darkness. And beneath that sorrow there was fear. A deep, primal, existential dread that was so potent it felt like a physical pressure against the hull of the station. Their origin, the Glypton analyst reported, its voice strained. They did not evolve in this galaxy. Their race memory speaks of a journey across the intergalactic void. They are refugees. They have been running for eons. Running from what? Warlord Grask, also present and now thoroughly humbled, asked from the back of the room. As if in answer, the human technicians isolated the most fundamental part of the archive. It was a repeating signal, the very foundation of the hegemony's hive mind, the thing that had driven them mad with terror and desperation. It was not a message. It was not a warning. It was, as one human scientist whispered in horrified awe, a scream. A scream rendered in the pure language of mathematics and physics, a waveform of pure despair that had been echoing across the void for millions of years. Valerius stepped forward, his face pale, and pointed to a coordinate set embedded within the signal's carrier wave. There, that's the origin point. The main star chart in the observation room recalibrated. The familiar spiral of their own galaxy shrank, becoming one of countless smudges of light. The map zoomed out, crossing the vast, terrifying emptiness between galaxies, the great silence. It centered on a region far, far away, a sky that had always been considered empty, a dark void between galactic clusters. But it was not empty. As the sensors cross-referenced the signal with deep space observation data, a new image began to resolve. A structure, something impossibly vast, a web of dark matter and strange energy that dwarfed entire galaxies. It was a construct so immense and so ancient it made the Council's millennia of history seem like the blink of an eye, and it was stirring. The signal the hegemony had been fleeing was a single, repeating pulse emanating from its core. The first sign that something that had been sleeping for geologic time was beginning to wake up. A silence deeper and more profound than any ever experienced in the grand chamber fell over the observation deck. The hegemony were not the enemy. They were the first wave of victims, the heralds of a doom so colossal it defied imagination. They were not a tide of conquerors. They were the terrified froth pushed ahead of a cosmic tsunami. All of their conflict, the Council's betrayal, humanity's warning, the desperate war, it had all been a small, parochial squabble on the shore while the ocean itself was preparing to rise. Vorlag looked from the horrifying image on the star chart to the calm, grim face of emissary Valerius. He finally understood. He had thought humanity's strength was their technology, their impossible ships, their devastating weapons. He had been wrong. He had thought it was their unity, their ability to act as one. He had been partially right. But their greatest strength was the very thing he had once dismissed as a weakness, their philosophy. The unwavering, almost insane belief that every single life was precious, a light worth preserving. It was a belief born from a history of clawing their way up from the mud, of facing down their own extinction time and again. It was a principle they had been willing to isolate themselves for, a principle they had returned from that isolation to defend. And now he saw it not as a sentimental ideal, but as the only weapon that could possibly matter against the vast, consuming darkness that was coming for them all. The final warning had not just been for the Council. It had been for the entire galaxy. Wake up. Remember what is worth fighting for. The night is coming.